There's always that one game, a game that ended way too soon or never got the follow-up you just knew it deserved. You finish the campaign, sit through the credits, and then the waiting starts. You hold on to the hope, maybe a sequel announcement will come out of nowhere, but it never does. This video showcases some of the best games we have played that fit that description. Amazing stories and worlds that deserve more, but unfortunately never got a sequel. So without further ado, let's get started.
If we're gonna get through this, then when I ask you to do something, you need to do it immediately.
Let's kick off this list with Enslaved Odyssey to the west. There's something haunting about this game that sticks with you, especially that ending. You spend the entire game developing this evolving relationship between Monkey and Trip, traveling through a breathtakingly detailed post-apocalyptic world. Everything's falling apart, but it still feels alive. You've got these old relics of tech mingled with nature reclaiming everything. Monkey's brute strength pairs perfectly with Trip's tech-savvy nature, and gameplay-wise, that cooperation made for some pretty memorable moments, especially when the stakes were high. The combat in the game is solid, but what sticks with you are those cinematic moments. Monkey fighting off massive mechs while Trip manipulates the environment to help. It felt like they only just started to show what kind of world this really was, with advanced robotics and the human struggle to survive. Then it ends, and ends on a cliffhanger no less. So players are just left thinking that this can't be it. There's so much unexplored territory here, literally and figuratively. The game teased more advanced underground factions, hints of technology under the surface, and character growth that never fully happened. That ending felt like the first chapter of a saga we never got. A sequel could have expanded the world, pushed the tech even further, and delved deeper into how far humanity had fallen. Enslaved had the heart for something much grander. Those possibilities, that untapped world, just sit there waiting, leaving players wondering about that what next that never came.
What are you doing here? I'm sure you and Penju have a lot of top-secret backdoor business to attend to.
Look, I'm sorry about how I acted in there. Just playing the part. I'm already out there on the streets. I hear things like this ketamine racket.
Sleeping Dogs. The thing about Sleeping Dogs is that it doesn't waste time trying to stand out. It just does. Hong Kong is the real star here. Few open-world games manage to breathe life into their settings quite like this one. You've got these vibrant streets, lit up with neon signs, busy markets, and people walking around everywhere. That atmosphere feels authentic, making it both a character and a location. It's not just some backdrop. You actually feel like you're part of something larger, as Wei Shen navigates these tight, sketchy alleyways and modern high-rises. Then there's the combat. It's smooth, fast, and fluid. The hand-to-hand fighting mixed with parkour movement set this game apart from the GTA clones it often gets compared to. Kind of like the cop dramas you saw growing up, Sleeping Dogs took familiar elements like undercover cop, crime gangs, and made them work in a space that felt new. A game where you legitimately felt like a dangerous player in a dangerous city. But what gives Sleeping Dogs the edge is Wei Shen himself. His story has all these layers that show the toll of being undercover. You feel for him as he's torn between his duty as a police officer and the bonds he forms with the gang. Wei's story had so much more to offer. The cultural aspects of being stuck between two worlds, the morality of being undercover, and Hong Kong's criminal landscape could have been explored so much further. There's still untapped potential there. All it needed was one more chapter, and both Wei and Hong Kong deserved that.
We scour the district in pairs. Isabeau, you and Lafayette take the high street from the south end. Galahad and I will move in from the north.
Next up is The Order 1886. This game managed to build a world that just drew you in. From the Victorian architecture to the twisted alternate history full of steampunk tech and supernatural creatures, it was one of those games that really felt different. At its core, this was a world full of potential, ancient orders, half-breed werewolves, rebellions, and a mysterious conspiracy about to be unraveled. You feel like you've barely scratched the surface by the time the credits roll. Sure, the gameplay got its fair share of criticism. The overly cinematic approach kind of disrupted the flow, keeping some players at arm's length. That was the sticking point for a lot of people. It was like you were watching more than playing. But the foundation, the story, was rock solid. The lore here was every bit as compelling as the visuals, and The Order absolutely nailed that atmosphere. Now, with modern hardware like the PS5 and its crazy SSD speeds and graphical power, The Order could look even more jaw-dropping. Imagine the foggy streets of London dripping in 4K with ray tracing, or the detailed interiors of a steampunk airship looking straight up photorealistic. A sequel could have addressed the criticisms head-on, shifting the balance toward more action and less cinematic fluff, while building more around that rich lore. Picture the responsive gameplay we've got in today's blockbusters combined with this world. Plus, dropping this gem on the PC too? Seems wild we haven't seen where the Order, or the world itself, could have gone next.
What the fuck is that?
Let's go with big and hopefully dead demon, shall we?
Up next, we have Shadows of the Damned. Shadows of the Damned leans into its weirdness in a way that makes it unforgettable. It's like a fever dream version of a grindhouse film. Demons, a talking skull that turns into all kinds of weapons, and an over-the-top protagonist who's just the right mashup of brooding anti-hero and crass jokester. You're playing as this demon hunter, Garcia Hotspur, who's chasing through hell to rescue his girlfriend from the underworld's big bad. Sounds standard, but this game was anything but ordinary. This blend of horror, action, and dark humor gives Shadows such a unique identity, largely thanks to its creative team, including gaming legends like Suda51. The combat wasn't revolutionary, but it mixed in just the right touch of strangeness, using your ex-demon sidekick's skull as a multifunctional weapon, for example. The enemy design too, from grotesque creatures to bizarre bosses, made each encounter feel fresh. And then there's that soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka, atmospheric, eerie, entirely fitting the vibe. Looking back though, Shadows of the Damned feels like it was only the beginning of something much bigger. You've got this chaotic underworld full of bizarre creatures and twisted environments that just beg for more exploration. The humor, the world building, and even the janky but lovable gameplay. It all felt like it was setting up sequels that never came. Instead, years later, we get a remaster. Don't get it wrong, seeing the game shine in higher resolution is fun, but players who took a deep dive back then, they know Shadows of the Damned has so much more to offer.
Now I'm ready.
Next on the list is Star Wars Republic Commando. Alright, Star Wars Republic Commando. You know, this game was so much more than just another Star Wars shooter. It's like the commandos you're leading genuinely feel like a squad you're responsible for. Every mission, every order you're giving them, it's tactical, it's purposeful, and it's got emotional weight when things go sideways. The combat's tight too, with that gear you're managing. Vibroblades, blasters, sniper attachments. Well, it all just clicks. Everything feels designed perfectly for the squad dynamic, and it feels different from the usual Jedi-focused adventures in that galaxy far, far away. And the story? It draws you in. You're not some mystical Force user. You're out there in the trenches, a clone, dealing with the gritty, unfancy side of the war. Anyone who has played the game probably thought the way they handled the characters was way too good to let it end after the credits rolled. There was supposed to be so much more. Yeah, Star Wars Imperial Commando was planned, and some concept art even exists. The idea was to explore what those commandos went through after Order 66, which would have added so much depth to the whole lore. It's like they were on the edge of breaking the dynamic wide open, giving voices to these characters outside of just being faceless soldiers. And then nothing, just concept art and a canceled project, leaving you wishing for that deeper dive into Imperial Commando territory.
I feel like I've been hit by a freight train.
Alpha Protocol. Espionage RPGs aren't exactly overflowing in the gaming space, and Alpha Protocol filled that gap perfectly in a way not many games have since. The whole spy thriller RPG hybrid thing it had going, with branching dialogue choices and decisions that had lasting impacts on the story, it felt at times almost like Mass Effect went undercover. You weren't just picking dialogue options, you were shaping missions, relationships, and even entire plot lines on the fly, all while dashing across the globe in some classic spy thriller style locations. The game had ambition, and while other games were focused on saving galaxies or slaying dragons, Alpha Protocol was about leveraging connections, lying your way out of a sticky situation, or going in guns blazing. Sure, it suffered from some clunky combat and rough AI, but those are problems you can patch up with good polish. What it got right, like the way relationships with your contacts could flip at any moment, pushed the RPG experience in fresh directions. The way your choices weren't just binary good-bad, but impacted who trusted you or would betray you kept you on edge every mission. It's wild that Alpha Protocol never got another shot, especially when the spy genre feels so underutilized. With modern RPG design, a sequel could embrace that complex web of espionage and intrigue while smoothing out the rough edges. It's the perfect setup for a deep, systems-driven RPG that lets you be both James Bond and Jason Bourne, responding in your own way to ever-evolving threats.
Know how to thank you, Herr Devlin. I will never forget what you have done today.
Seems His Majesty's government is in your debt as well. But don't expect a thank you note from Bishop.
Next up is the Saboteur. The Saboteur really brought something different to the table with its mix of stealth and action, all set against the backdrop of Nazi-occupied France. The black and white visual style made it feel like stepping into a noir war film, where color would slowly return as you liberated areas. It wasn't just a gimmick either, it actually added weight to the narrative, making you feel that transformation from hopelessness to defiance. Players loved the vibe, the idea of moving through the streets of Paris as this roguish Irishman, Sean Devlin, taking on the Nazis with a cigarette hanging from his mouth. That said, while it had this unique look and feel, the Saboteur had its share of struggles. Its open world could be a bit empty, making side activities feel repetitive after a while. On top of that, the AI wasn't the smartest, which kinda took some tension out of those stealth segments. With today's hardware, though, it's hard not to consider how much more they could do with it. The world could be filled with more life and dynamic systems. Imagine large crowds in Paris, more destructible environments, and smarter enemy behaviors that actually react to how you sabotage their operations. Modern consoles can handle way more complex open worlds, meaning that the blending of stealth and action could be fluid, creating more varied mission structures, with new ways to approach each objective based on better physics, AI, and mechanics. The potential for a bigger, more immersive France, maybe even moving into new territories, is right there. It seems like Sean's fight wasn't meant to be a one-and-done story.
Boom! If I thought you could, you'd have a deal. And then what?
Gastown.
Next up, we have Mad Max. Mad Max wasn't about saving the world. It was about crawling through the remains of one. You're there in the dirt, breathing in dust and gasoline, clinging to whatever scraps of humanity the wastelands left behind. The world felt like it was out to kill you at every turn. Scarcity everywhere, with every rusted-out car chase or fistfight for a bottle as visceral as it gets. The magnum opus, your ride, was everything. It was your weapon, your shelter, and your best shot at survival, all rolled into one. The vehicle combat felt like the heartbeat of the game, hammering away as wind tore through the wasteland while cars slammed into each other like they were made of nothing. Now, maybe it never went mainstream like some other open-world games, but Mad Max nailed the feeling of desolation. The issue was that after spending enough time in the wasteland, things tended to blur together. Each camp began to look a lot like the one before it. The enemies? A bit predictable. As brutal as things were, the post-apocalyptic chaos could have used a little more variety. Now, if this game got a sequel on today's hardware, there's no reason the wasteland couldn't evolve right alongside the player. Think of storms that shift dunes, changing the entire layout of the terrain. One day you're skidding across familiar territory, and the next, a sandstorm swallowed that route completely, hiding enemies or opening up new scavenging grounds. The feeling of isolation, combined with new environmental dangers, could keep players on edge in ways the first game just didn't have the tools for. Plus, they could crank up the vehicle combat, more cars, more enemies, and even larger scale battles across massive chunks of desert.
You are Captain Renko, are you not? Don't look so surprised. Your name's right on your uniform. America's charming penchant for individuality.
Singularity flew under the radar for a lot of people. It might have had your standard first-person shooter elements, but then time itself became the weapon, changing the age of objects, deteriorating enemies into dust, fixing broken pathways. It was like handing players a sci-fi toolbox and letting them mess with reality mid-battle. And the game made that feel so natural. One moment you'd be blasting through Soviet monsters, the next rewinding a wall to patch up holes and create cover. It was that mix of shooter grit with reality warping unpredictability that made Singularity feel different. The thing is, the concept opened a ton of doors, but it barely scratched the surface of what time manipulation could offer. You age an enemy into a skeletal wreck in seconds, but what if you could take that concept further? Modern tech could push those ideas in ways that the original honestly didn't even have the chance to imagine. Picture larger, more open environments that are affected by your time-altering powers, entire buildings collapsing, then rebuilt in real time, affecting not just combat, but how you explore a living world. Where Singularity might have stumbled was in not fully exploiting this mechanic. AI wasn't always the sharpest, and the narrative, as cool as it was, felt a bit rushed. But technology today could take that loose thread and weave a whole new tapestry, time-bending not just as a weapon, but as a puzzle, a shield, an evolving method of interacting with the world in wildly creative ways. There's untapped genius here that never got its due. It's like the moment the game really started playing with some great ideas, everything wrapped up too soon.
Holy crap.
Jason, you okay?
I'm in some kind of factory. These guys are rolling out enough ordnance to invade a small country. Maybe even a big one.
Shadow Complex. Alright, so Shadow Complex had this classic Metroidvania vibe, but pushed it into 3D spaces in a way that made it feel fresh back when it dropped. It knew what it was doing. Side-scrolling action, solid platforming, and using exploration as a reward system. You'd start off pretty bare bones, and gradually, as you uncovered more of the shadowy government facility, you'd kit yourself out with sweet upgrades. Things like double jumps or grappling hooks. And every tool you unlocked completely opened up new areas, so you were constantly flicking between tight combat and creative problem solving. Now the kicker, this remastered version came to multiple platforms later, but there's always this gnawing sense that Shadow Complex had way more stories to tell. Not just about the protagonist, but about the massive world it introduced. This dystopian conspiracy was only scratching at something bigger, and that's what made it feel ripe for further exploration. With modern-day gaming tech, you're looking at a perfect opportunity to craft something far deeper. Picture a sequel with dynamic lighting, real-time physics, and new layers of verticality in the level design. Enemies could interact with environments, blasting through breakable walls, chasing you into deeper, darker parts of massive facilities. Story-wise, they could delve into new political conspiracies with way more intrigue. What made Shadow Complex feel addictive was that tight, evolving sense of progression. New-gen hardware could take that progression and stretch it, giving players way more open-ended spaces, more paths, and more thrilling avenues to explore. The remaster showed how strong the design still was, but with the tools available now, the Metroidvania formula could go so much further. The original never needed to be flashy, it just needed to be smart. Now it could be both. Next up is Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno definitely pushed some boundaries. You had this insane, visceral interpretation of the afterlife, where each circle of hell felt more messed up than the last. There was something really special about how it combined the brutality of combat with this deep, unsettling atmosphere. The game kind of tapped into something larger than itself. You weren't just pushing through waves of enemies, you were literally wading through hell, dragging your morality with you. The combat had its moments for sure, very God of War-esque, with fast combos and this larger-than-life scythe. That didn't feel like the real hook, though. You were there for the world. Each level offered these punishing but fascinating landscapes, and dealing with the souls and creatures inhabiting them pulled you into Dante's moral dilemma. A sequel could have taken that world even further. Take the combat and build on it, more fluid, maybe with a deeper customization aspect to sharpen those celestial and demonic powers. And imagine where they could have gone with the story. The Inferno ends, but you still had Purgatory and Paradise on the table. There was something untapped there. Like Dante's personal journey could have evolved way beyond where it ended in the first game, really digging deeper into that conflict between righteousness and sin. It's the kind of game that sets itself up perfectly for another chapter, but yeah, it never got that chance.
Hey, Marshall. Welcome to Japan, brother. That's my welcome, your ugly ass?
Up next, we have Binary Domain. Binary Domain flew under the radar, yeah? Think about it. Here was this dark futuristic world where machines had become almost indistinguishable from humans. And on top of that, you had squad-based combat that really emphasized teamwork in a way others weren't doing at the time. You weren't just barking out orders to NPCs. You were building relationships with them, watching how they reacted to your decisions. That's where Binary Domain stood out. The interactions with your squad actually meant something. You weren't just relying on them in combat, they were judging your actions. Be a good leader, and they'll back you up when things get rough. Mess up, and they might start second-guessing you. That trust system created this extra layer of tension, which worked especially well against the backdrop of a story centered around questioning humanity itself. The loyalty system wasn't perfect. It could have been tuned, and that's something a sequel could have explored easily. Plus the combat? Tight. You had these insane robotic enemies with pieces flying off them as you shot. There was satisfaction in dismantling them bit by bit, which was so different from just the typical headshots in other shooters. A second game could have cranked that up, maybe allowing more customization, more squad involvement. And then, just think about the story. It set up all sorts of questions about humans, robots, and everything in between, but nothing came after that first game. Okami deserves a second chapter simply because of what it brought to the table visually and emotionally. You've got that iconic Sumi-e art style, Japanese ink wash painting, and it wasn't just for show. You felt like you were painting the world back to life with every brushstroke, whether you were restoring a wilted landscape or slashing your enemies. Honestly, it's one of those rare games that isn't just about mechanics, it's a sort of visual poetry. The combat was solid, but never the main event. It was all about exploring Japanese mythology through this beautifully interactive lens. Playing as Amaterasu, the sun goddess in wolf form, you weren't just powerful, you embodied creation itself, bringing light to a world in darkness. There's this serene, meaningful vibe to it that most other games miss. A sequel could easily branch into new areas of mythology, gods or spirits from untapped Japanese folklore, even creatures from broader Asian myths, could offer endless opportunities for fresh storytelling. Now, it has some hurdles. Capcom seems hesitant. Platinum Games was supposed to take it on in 2015, but that never panned out. Nakamura's studio? Yeah, that's got potential. There's that hope, right? The IP's still with Capcom, so it might happen through a co-development. Any artistically driven studio with a strong understanding of Japanese culture could take on the challenge and carry the torch, keeping that visual feast alive. There's just this need now for the story to continue, for Amaterasu to rise again in a whole new world.
Dear Lord, this place is enormous. Who'd build something like this and leave it to a gang of savages?
Perhaps they did not leave.
Next up is Bulletstorm. Bulletstorm is the game people didn't even realize they needed. Look, it wasn't all about the story. It was about chaos, ridiculousness, and style. The skill shot system, that's where the real magic was. You weren't just shooting for headshots, you were looking for a way to kick enemies into cactuses, send them flying into spikes, or pull them into explosions, all in the name of creative carnage. Something about the way those moments strung together made each kill a statement, especially when the game actively rewarded you for being as over the top as possible. You're basically playing through an action movie where the main plot is, how badly can you mess up your enemies? Now, Bulletstorm leaned hard into absurdity, and that's exactly why a sequel would be so good. Imagine even crazier environments and more chaotic weaponry. Like sure, they gave you a leash to yank enemies around. Imagine expanding that concept, like a whole arsenal of ridiculous toys that let you manipulate the battlefield in totally unexpected ways. It's the kind of game where they could just throw the rulebook out the window and let you get wild. That's the fun. The remaster, Bulletstorm Full Clip Edition, brought it back to PC and consoles, showing that there's still love for this insane shooter. People still want to punch through walls with a shotgun blast while cracking jokes from the 2010s. One sequel with new weapons and maybe a bigger world to wreak havoc in. There's definitely fuel for that fire. You can picture it, a game where the objective is to creatively destroy everything in sight without ever losing that attitude.
I can fix anything, except that.
Metal is dead.
Up next is Brutal Legend. Brutal Legend was like a headbanger's paradise in game form. You had these massive landscapes inspired by heavy metal album covers, where everything had a kind of over-the-top guitar shredding feel. From molten lava rivers to skeleton-infested forests, there was something distinct about every corner of the game's world. The best part? It didn't take itself too seriously. It knew it was absurd and leaned into that with Jack Black giving voice to Eddie Riggs, a roadie-turned-hero who smashes his way through armies using an axe. What really set Brutal Legend apart, though, was how it blended action with real-time strategy. You'd be slashing enemies on the ground 1 minute and directing armies of headbangers or demons the next. It was this chaotic mashup of genres that somehow worked, even though most players didn't expect it. The real letdown was how underplayed the RTS aspects felt. It had so much potential to really evolve. A sequel could dial in on this by giving players more control over those big, climactic battles, while also introducing more gods and rock subgenres. Think punk rock, glam, even prog rock gods competing in this massive cosmic battle of music. A deeper strategy system could make that all the more satisfying. And just the thought of more Jack Black cracking ridiculous lines, yeah, that might be enough on its own. It's still surprising the game didn't receive more recognition. It wasn't the gameplay itself that threw people off, it was the strange visuals that threw a lot of folks outside the metal scene. Next on the list is D4 Dark Dreams Don't Die. This game was one of those games that left people incredibly intrigued and incredibly frustrated all at once. You had this wild episodic mystery from the mind behind Deadly Premonition. So right from the start, you know you're in for a ride. The game put players into the shoes of David Young, a detective investigating his wife's murder through these time-bending, reality-warping trips. And like anything from Swery, it was filled with bizarre characters, strange items, and a ton of offbeat humor. Even though players were solving smaller mysteries throughout, the game always had this larger, looming plot around David's wife. There was a creepy sense that nothing was really as it seemed, and you were always just on the verge of uncovering something big. But then, the episodes stopped coming. You reached the end of the first part, and nothing followed, leaving a whole bunch of unanswered questions and dangling threads. The thing is, D4 was meant to be weird. The episodic format actually could have worked in the game's favor. It was designed to invite more odd mysteries, deeper exploration into David's powers, and that slow burn unraveling of the main story. A sequel, or just a continuation, could dive right back into that strange world and give players the closure they've been craving. Next up is Mark of the Ninja. Mark of the Ninja was stealth perfection in 2D form. Unlike most stealth-based games that can get bogged down by clunky mechanics, this one gave you full control over your movements. It was smooth, fluid, and just felt right. The way you could slink through shadows, dispatch enemies, and vanish without a trace had this very satisfying flow to it. It wasn't just about hiding or waiting out patrols, it made you feel like a calculated predator, able to adapt and improvise, chaining moments of silence, death, and escape in a constant rhythm. What made it even stronger was how visual the stealth was. You could see exactly what the enemies could and couldn't, so instead of guesswork, it became about making those moments count. The gadgets and techniques the game introduced weren't just gimmicks, they felt integral to giving you options on how to clear each map. Plus, the game rewarded creative thinking. The more inventive or non-lethal your approach, the more satisfied you felt navigating the levels. A sequel could easily build on that foundation. Imagine having new environments with more layers, underground networks, rooftops, or even large multi-zone arenas connected by vertical spaces. There's also room for more complex ninja abilities, like manipulating environments beyond smoke bombs or traps. The game already had a highly polished system, but a sequel could push it even further, experimenting with deeper AI behaviors or new enemy types that force different kinds of stealth tactics. There's so much potential to show just how far the art of stealth gaming can go.
The hell was that?
I'm picking up a distress call.
Patch it through.
Spec Ops: The Line is one of those games that left a massive impact because of its emotional punch, not its gameplay alone. You start out thinking you're in for a pretty standard military shooter, but then, as you venture deeper into Dubai, the horrors of war, especially the moral gray spaces, start to unfold. The shifting perspectives, the hallucinations, and the way it forced you to confront the consequences of your actions made it something way beyond just another action title. The telling point was the psychological toll. The game had moments where you're left questioning who's the true enemy, what's real, and who can shoulder the blame for the atrocities committed. If there was any shooter that truly deserved a sequel to dive deeper into the mind's breaking point, it's this one. A new setting, a new conflict, a new soldier haunted by different choices. It could easily take that same form of psychological warfare and drop it into a completely fresh landscape. Think about all the different ways trauma from war could be explored, whether it's set in a new urban wasteland or somewhere else entirely. The first game didn't just challenge players with difficult firefights, it challenged beliefs about warfare and heroism. That's something rare and powerful. The story structure is important too. It was never about bombastic moments or over-the-top spectacle. It was all about the long, slow descent into madness. Carrying that same tone forward in a sequel is where it could really shine. Just imagine all new perspectives on moral ambiguity and fractured psyches.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is easily one of those games that feels like it could have been just the beginning. It nailed the punishing difficulty that From Software fans crave, but with its own twist. Fluidity in combat, precision with the katana, and that grappling hook which made traversal feel dangerous and thrilling. The way you'd clash swords with enemies, timing it down to the split second, made every duel feel like a life or death dance. You'd think a game that won Game of the Year would have had more coming post-launch, right? Yet, since its release, there hasn't been anything more. No expansion, no DLC to explore more of that hauntingly beautiful world. The game was packed with lore, creatures, and untold stories steeped in Japanese mythology, and exploring deeper into that could be the perfect ground for future content. Imagine diving into a new region, more mythical beasts, or even facing new deadly enemies who've honed their skills to match yours. New prosthetic tools, tougher boss fights, there's this unfulfilled feeling knowing the potential left on the table. 5 years later, no sequel, no whispers of anything further from the devs. It's strange because Sekiro's world feels so ready for more, filled with elements just asking to be fleshed out. Instead, we've been left with a masterpiece that hasn't expanded at all since release, even though its swordplay and rich mythological roots scream for deeper exploration. Sekiro is one of my all-time favorite game, and I am really hoping the devs will make a sequel for this game, or maybe even some DLC just like what they did to Elden Ring.
Mom, why'd you marry that phony? What is wrong with you? I can't believe this.
And finally, to conclude our list, we have the Rockstar gem, Bully. There's something kind of charming about Bully. It wasn't just a Rockstar game that revolved around chaos and destruction. Instead, you had Jimmy Hopkins navigating all the social cliques and teenage drama in a giant boarding school. It was a pretty small world when you think about it, but packed with so much personality. The whole high school thing felt fresh compared to other titles from the same genre that like to blow things up or go for a more gritty tone. And Bully left so much room for growth, like so much. Imagine if Rockstar had jumped into the college experience or expanded those cliques. Frats and sororities with their hidden rivalries, or campus politics. It's easy to see how the series could have shifted into new social dynamics and life stages beyond high school. And since Rockstar nailed atmosphere with the original, whether it was catching a kid shoving you into a locker or skateboarding around town, the crazier college world would have been an easy playground for their writing. What's odd is that the fanbase clearly never forgot Bully. You know, people continuously bring it up, talk about its unique place in gaming history, yet it remains this one-off, and the potential, yeah, you can still feel it lingering. A sequel wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, just push open those doors and expand that world. Instead, Bully feels like an unfinished chapter Rockstar wrote out in its waiting room. I know there are lots of rumors about Bully 2, but again, those are all rumors that has been around for more than a decade. Nothing is really concrete, and right now, I think it's pretty obvious that there will be no new Bully game since the developer is working for the GTA 6, which is due next year. So, those are just a few games that left a mark but never got the follow-up they deserved. If you enjoyed this list and it got you reminiscing about your own favorites, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to stick around for more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe.